Hello, everybody. So we're up to week 7 now. It's getting very near the end. If you have past due assignments or anything, please get those in as soon as possible. I guess there's still a week left, but you don't want to be overwhelmed at the last minute. I know most people have more than just one class going on. And with that in mind, I like to ease up near the end if possible. I try to front load the courses and cover a lot of material near the beginning of the semester. So then when we get near the end and you have lots of things like a research essay in this class or final projects in other classes and lots of stuff coming due at once, there's not as much in our class per se. So a fairly short list of things to look at today. A couple that we sort of ran out of time for last week. Probably could have fit them in the schedule last week, but y'all might remember last week was it was cybersecurity. So just a long list of definitions, and it seemed like a good lecture to kind of break up in multiple parts. Is just a whole lot of writing definitions. And then this week's material, we'll get started looking at that, is about virtual machines. So just a few things to talk about there. There'll probably be some fairly short class periods, both today and tomorrow. But we still got a lot of things to talk about. There's also something about graphs I wanted to try to work in somewhere. Might work that in today. A follow-up to that discussion board from 2 weeks ago, I think. Whenever we talk about graphical representations of data, just a quick introduction. There's some well-known facts that go with that related to what psychologists have dubbed color theory. That's the big one. But there's also different impacts that various fonts and how we present the data can make a big difference. So we'll talk about that maybe today. But to start with, a couple things that we sort of ran out of time for last week. Probably could have fit them in, but last week was just lots and lots of writing notes on the board. So wanted to break that up a little bit. Add her name to the list, and then I'll go over by the board. Okay. So last week we were talking about cybersecurity. Went over a bunch of terms, definitions, talked about different malicious attacks, malicious software, talked about scams. And that's a big problem, because really what comes down to with scams is somebody's lying in order to benefit from you, usually for profit. But the thing is, it's not illegal to lie to someone. That's why you can usually spot phishing emails, because the logo will be changed up a little bit, or they'll change the name. So like if they wanted to pretend to be Bank of America, they might call themselves Bank of Americas with an S at the end. You can usually spot scam emails from little things like that, because if they do that, then the scam is still just a lie, and it's not illegal to lie to someone. But if they were to use an actual name, then it becomes forgery, and forgery is a crime that falls under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department, which means the Secret Service is the one that investigates it. So if they, there's a fine line there that helps make phishing emails easy to spot, because they can't use the actual logos or names, or otherwise it crosses that line from just be lying about something into forgery, which is a major federal crime. We talked about that and trying to protect our system from all those different things. Scams are kind of on the user, but with malicious attacks and software, there's various things we can try and do. The two big ones we wrote kind of ended the list with last week was mitigation and disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is kind of obvious because even beyond security reasons, we want to have backups in place. We know things go wrong occasionally, so we want to be able to back that up. And security reasons kind of put the weight of disaster recovery and backups onto the security personnel. And the other one, mitigation, is usually our best defense. So the idea is, well, if we're going to allow anybody to have access to the system, in particular legitimate users, right, all the employees at our company, we want them to have access to our system. It's the outsiders that we want to keep, the outsiders that should not have access that we want to keep out. But by allowing the legitimate users to have access, there are routes into the system. So our best defense against those outsiders we want to keep out is really mitigation, which means we make it very, very difficult for them to get in. We can't make it completely impossible, but if we make our system very difficult to get in, hopefully people will go, will give up and go find a system that's easier to get into. And a couple of the main points along with mitigation were the last two things on the notes. The first one is encryption. As a way to make our data hard to read. What's the definition here? So it's going to say data converted to code, data encoded in such a way to hide its true nature. So basically we take something that, whatever our data is, I'll just write a simple binary one up here. So we covered binary code, you might remember the representation for the number 5, but we don't want anybody to be able to look at that and tell that we have the number 5 stored in our database. So we'll run it through some sort of algorithm. Oh, actually, I should have looked ahead of my notes. I haven't the actual example. So let me write a full thing here. So somewhere in our database, I'll just jump ahead to the actual example. We're going to have the letter A stored in there somewhere. A capital A is definitely going to show up in our database somewhere. And the computer knows that from ASCII code or the extension of Unicode, it's going to be number 65. Which in binary looks like 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. So we have that number stored in our database somewhere. And whatever that's a part of, that particular character, maybe it's some important word or a password or something, we don't want people to be able to read that. So what we do is we run it through a mathematical formula to make it hard to read. And the idea is we'll come up with some sort of secret key, something that an outsider is not going to know, and then run it through a math formula that'll just kind of scramble it up. So for example, secret key. In order to talk about the concepts on the board, I'm going to do in a very simple example, something that would be cracked probably in a couple of nanoseconds, but the concepts scale up from there. Kind of like when we covered binary code, we can use 4 bits in our example because the rest of the bits follow the same pattern. But we want to write this down, so we'll make an easy example. I'll just choose a random number, say 23, some number that that users or that outsiders are not going to know. It's internal to our system. Typically in real examples, the key would be encrypted as well. So we have to decrypt the key and and then use that decrypted key to decrypt the actual data. So there's multiple levels. But for a simple example, I'll just do something like this. K2x plus K1x. So that might be some sort of encryption. That equals our encrypted value. And what these are is the X is representing the data we actually want to store. So this binary code, or for the purposes of writing math down, I'm just going to stick with writing the 65. We're still working through that math. So the simple formula here, and then the K, K1 and K2, let me write that one different. Already like that, so it's easier to tell which one's 1 and 2. K1 and 2 are the digits from our number. So we scramble it up even more, so maybe K1 is the first digit and K2 is the second digit. So even once we have that secret key, we split it up into the separate digits and use it differently in our algorithm. And the key part of an encryption key is that we can get our data back. Because we could do that all day long, right? We could just make up some math formula, run our number through some really, really complex math formula. But at that point, all we've done is jumble it up. It's not necessarily encrypted, it's just mixed up and randomized. In order to be encryption, we also have to be able to get it back. All right, something like this. So in this case, if we work the elementary algebra on this simple example that I wrote here, which basically means we need to solve for X. We factor in X out, get K2 plus K1 equals E, and then divide all this off to figure out what X is. So X is whatever our encrypted value is divided by the sum of those digits. Again, a very oversimplified example to show that, but we do have to have a math formula that goes both ways. We need to be able to mix up our data so that others can't read it, but we also have to be able to get it back. Otherwise, mixing it up would just be completely useless. And then for something like this example, somewhere in our database, there's a capital A written, maybe somebody's name or medical records or other privileged information that we don't want people having access to. And to hide it or mitigate how easy it is to access that data, we can run it through this encryption algorithm. So we just plug the 65 into that X along with the digits from our secret key and get something like this. So 3 times 65 plus 2 times 65. How much is that? 5 times 65 is 300 plus 25. Yeah, 300 plus 25, so 325. And then in our database, as far as anyone can see, we store the number 325, which also adds a little bit extra encryption because 325 won't fit in 8 bits of data. So in order to store the encrypted value, we need a 16-bit number. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, that's not even gonna fit. I'll just start adding them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, so it takes up almost the whole board to put a 16-bit number here. Most of them are going to be zeros. Let's see, 1. So we have 2 to the 0 power, or 1's column, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. That'll be enough to write this number. But then we have all these other columns. So if somebody did access our database and saw that encrypted value, they don't really, they have all these extra bits over here that aren't really part of our data. We could just put gibberish in those. And when we run it back through the encryption algorithm, we'll know what our computer system will know what to do with it, but it's hidden because it's hard to tell what the original data was once we put this in there. What is that? 256, we have one of those. We saw this before, 325 minus 256. What we have left? 5, 6, so 65 left to go. 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. So when somebody looks at our, if they gain access to the database, they'd see this number, plus just a bunch of random bits here, filling space, and would have to figure out what the original data was from that little chunk there. So it makes it harder to access the data. And obviously a very oversimplified example for the board, since we're working through it by hand. Obviously computers can handle much more complicated algorithms, algebraic formulas that we can go both ways on to get there and get back. But as far as us, when we need to access that data, we know these first, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the first 7 bits are just gibberish. So we can have the computer automatically throw those away and then plug that 325 that's left into our decryption algorithm. So 325 divided by the 3 plus 2, or 325 divided by 5 is going to get us back right back to the 65. So that's the idea of encryption. It just makes it hard to read the data. Not impossible to read the data, because if we're just assigning a computer software program to do this, it's just going to run through every possible combination and see if it can decrypt it and make sense out of what it is. So we have much more complicated encryption algorithms than this, but that's the basic idea. Just some math formula that we can go both ways on, plug a number in and get some encrypted value, or we can plug an encrypted value in and get back to our original value. And that makes it a little bit harder to read the data if somebody gains access to it. Yeah, usually big numbers. Is that on this list? Yeah, key pairs are on here. So something like this, it's not uncommon to have like a 64-bit number, or sometimes a 256-bit number. That's a really big number. There's a lot of digits in there. So we can pull those digits off one at a time and come up with a really complicated looking polynomial that works to store our data or hide our data so that people can't just immediately tell what it is. Is it okay if I erase this for the other section?
Yes.
I guess any more SHA encryption is what we'll see the most often. So it would have a 256-bit key that we do that with, 256-bit number that we do that with. RSA is still fairly common, but more and more things have been going to SHA, just because there's so many digits to work with when we encrypt our data. It doesn't make it impossible. It just makes it harder, like a brute force, some software that's just going to brute force it, take every guess at an algorithm until it finds it, has to take that many more guesses. or might have to take that many more guesses. Because if the software is just taking random guesses to try and get the algorithm, there's always that chance it could guess it on the first try. But that's a very, very slim chance. Virtually nothing, virtually impossible for that to happen, but it is still somewhat, it's still a chance. So that's it. Encrypting our data will make it hard to read, but then that's not going to be enough. We also want to restrict who has access to it. And that's the idea of access control. I just have a list of terms here. Well, a list of common ones. You're probably familiar with a lot of them. But access control is a way to identify user or users. We might do it as a group, sometimes groups, sometimes individuals, sometimes individuals within a group. There's different levels. But a way to identify users and keep a listing of what they can access, of what they have access to. That sounds like a good sentence. So we need a way to identify each particular user and a list of the restrictions so we know what that user is allowed to do or not to do. In our modern world, y'all are probably well aware of this. So this list I did put in order. I guess I should put a number there. So I put some of the most common ones in increasing usefulness for access control. The easier it would be to crack, the higher it is on the list here. So the first one's PIN numbers, a short list of numbers give us access. I think everybody knows what a PIN number is. I don't need to write a definition there, right? Like your ATM card, usually a 4-digit number. That probably, so at most there's what, 0000 through 9999. It's only 10,000 values. So if the computer just went to guess every single one, it's not going to take it long to guess 10,000 values. But on the ATM card example, your bank's going to put other restrictions. Those two endpoints I just mentioned, 0000 and 9999, the bank's computer system isn't going to let you use those as a PIN code. Like, nope, you can't use the same 4-digit. You have to use different digits. So the list is shorter than 10,000, really, right? Or banks will also stop you from using sequential numbers. Maybe not every bank. I know Chase will stop you from using sequential numbers. So like 3, 4, 5, 6 would not be a valid PIN number. It'd be too easy for another human to guess. So that list is actually way short. If there's 4 digits, that list is way shorter than 10,000 because of all the restrictions on there. A short list of numbers. Usually with PIN numbers, there's a restricted number of tries. Right? We know it's not going to take a software long to guess that number, so that there's only so many guesses allowed. I think everybody knows what a PIN number is. Next up is RFID badges. I should have got the RFID stuff out. I have something. I've got my badge for the lab. So little cards like this. So this gets in, opens the door in the GRE labs. which lately have been unlocked all the time anyway. But inside of there is just a little, there's a small chip that has a number stored on it, kind of like a SIM card. It's not really storage. It has data, but the data that's on there was hard coded at the factory. So we don't usually call those storage, but it is holding a short number. And then around the rest of that, there's like a little coil of wire. Electricity and magnetism are very related. So if we put, if a wire moves in a magnetic field, it creates electricity, or vice versa. If a magnet moves past wires, it creates electricity. So with the little badges, when they get brought up to the machine and then pulled away, right, if you just held it there and then turned the machine on and just kept holding it, it wouldn't register. There has to be some sort of movement, kind of like the triggers at a stoplight. There's a coil of wire under the pavement, so whenever it registers movement, it detects somebody's at the stoplight. It's not a weight sensor or anything like that. That way it can activate off a bicyclist or any size of vehicle, whether it's really big or really small. There's just a coil of wire under the paved asphalt. So when something moves past it, it creates a small bit of electricity, enough to activate. So when you move that card past there, the little electricity in the coil flows to the chip, and then is just enough electricity to broadcast its number, the number stored on that chip, a couple of feet at most. Really not even a couple of feet, a couple of inches. On a very if you were by a very, very powerful magnet moving really fast, it would go a couple of feet. On the RFID badges, maybe a couple of inches. But at the same time, that's something that can easily be faked. That's why it's way up at the top of the list. Because if you know the system, you can find ways to get around it, which sometimes happens, right? I had to do that on my Jeep. So about a used Jeep, the fob that went with it was long gone. So somebody went ahead and paid a bunch of money to program the RFID key. But if I ever lock my keys in or lose them, I'm really, really cheap. I don't like to spend a lot of money. So I just got a regular key and then figured out what was stored on the RFID key and copied that over to another system. So I can unlock my doors and still start my Jeep, even if I lose the key with all the RFID stuff in it. Because yeah, sometimes those are convenient, but if anybody's ever had that happen, like the batteries on your fob go down so that your car doesn't recognize you anymore, it's really, really inconvenient. It can happen in bad situations and stuff. So it's useful most of the time, because then just not anybody can start your car. But whenever that system fails on you, it's a terrible inconvenience. And replacing those sort of keys and fobs and things are kind of expensive. But that system can be faked. So if you know what you're doing, you can go ahead and fake it, but you kind of have to know the system. So like I have access to my Jeep. I know my own system, so I was able to duplicate that access. And instead of paying the Jeep dealership like $600 to duplicate that access, I did it for like 99 cents. But you do have to know the system to get around them, but it's still something that can be gotten around. Passwords are on there. And that's kind of it was kind of hard to figure out exactly where passwords should go in this list, because passwords also depend on the human a human picking a good password. Just because a human put in something and didn't tell anybody what they typed into the machine does not mean it's a secure password. And really, it's length alone. A lot of people want to go with special characters and things that look really strange. That only makes it hard for a human. If usually passwords are going to be guessed by a machine, or it's a machine that's going to be taking guesses, and the machine doesn't know the difference between the letters and the special character symbols on there. It's just going to start guessing combinations of Unicode values. So the length alone is what makes a secure password. So if you make a really long one, something like the punchline to your favorite joke, or something that describe a picture that you can visualize in your head, it's much, much easier for you to remember and much, much harder for machines or other people to guess. Multi-factor authentication. It's quite popular, but it doesn't add as much security as what people does. A great example of that is when it sends a text message. You go enter your password, and then on the next step, you have to receive a text message and type that in. Well, if you try to log on to the same site from your phone, it's going to send the text message to the device trying to access it, which there's different ways around that. Typically, you enter the password and call and text these days, but some sort of multiple ways to authenticate. That example I just mentioned was the password and get a text message. That's kind of the standard. But anything with multiple ways to get in. So maybe you have to have an RFID badge and a PIN number. That would be multi-factor authentication. It's somewhere down the list, but usually it's not as far as the last two on the list, because the last two would make the multi-factor part more difficult. So some combination of these, and this is not an exhaustive list, just some common ones to keep in mind. 5 key pairs. So usually 2 keys, a public key and a private key, which both have really long strings of data, usually 64-bit encoding. So, well, we're familiar with decimal, and we looked at hexadecimal, but sometimes when we have really, really, really long strings of bits, things that are gonna that don't relate to a number, or don't really relate to anything in particular we would ever want anything numeric for, we use Base64 encoding, which is just like those other systems we looked at, only with 64 symbols, 64 values. So we need ways to represent the numbers 0 through 63, which, just like hexadecimal, we start with our digits. So 0 through 9 are the first 10 digits. And then we have the alphabet. So that provides another 52 symbols, right? Uppercase letters first, and then lowercase letters. So 10 plus 52, we only need 2 more symbols for that. And there's not really a standard on the last 2 symbols for Base64 encoding. So if you look for Base64 encoding, the last 2 symbols, it will move left to right on your keyboard, and the shift key first. So kind of like the capital letters first. The ones with the shift key go first, and then left to right. And it's only 2 other symbols and a great big long string. So it's usually not hard to figure out what the last 2 are. So we store usually we see the keys that way. The thing being accessed keeps the public key and the user gets a private key. So they're both encrypted forms, and AWS uses this a lot. Or AWS kind of makes everybody use this whenever you start up a server. You'll start a server on there and they'll give you a key pair, and you'll just download one of those, one half of the pair. So you have this big long number basically, but in binary form, but when we print it out, it's in Base64 encoding. And we'll take that number, and when we go to log in, instead of entering a password or getting a text message or something, we'll just point at that key that we have, our private key, and they'll take that. Now they'll take the public key that they kept and use that on an encryption algorithm like we looked at a few minutes ago, and decrypt what that key is, and then use the number from that to decrypt something hidden in the public key. And if everything matches up, then it'll grant you access. So it almost is a type of multi-factor authentication itself, but they have a decrypted they have some encrypted data. Look at that as a number itself and use that to decrypt our encrypted data, and then once our data has been decrypted, that's used to decrypt whatever data they have, and at that point they should match up. So several steps, a much harder thing to fake, to hack in through. But again, still not impossible. 6 is biometric scanners. These have been around for a long time. If anybody's ever watched the old James Bond movies going back to the early 1960s, biometric scanners were around back then. But that's a good example of them being faked. And a lot of that they've gotten pretty accurate, but those things can still be fooled by looking at the wrong thing, depending on how they're set up, really. Computers do not recognize people the same way that people recognize other people, right? Recently on social media, y'all were probably well aware of that. Recently on social media, there started going around some posts talking about facial recognition, and during the pandemic, everybody wearing masks, it was blocking the facial recognition. But that is not true at all. The facial recognition was not impacted in the least bit by a mask. Computers do not, humans would sometimes not recognize each other with a mask, but with what machines we're looking at, they can recognize humans whether half your face is covered with a mask or not. Which that's a good point into, I think, what's next week's discussion board: dissemination of knowledge and how information spreads, what's true, what's not true. But you all are familiar with that stuff, right? Fingerprints, retina scans, facial recognition, all of those things. I remember I was in an office of, when was it? About 7 years ago, for a short-term consulting job, and one of the computers, the downstairs computer I always said that whenever I was in the office building, it had, instead of a password or a PIN number or anything normal, it actually had facial recognition set up. So to log into that computer, all I did was sit down in front of it. But it quite often took me more than one try because I would sit down in the wrong way. I might sit down this way, and then it's looking at the side of my face and not recognizing me. Or coming from the other side of the room and sit down this way, and again, it wouldn't recognize me. Or already be looking down at some notes, and there was a lot of ways that thing did not recognize me. It really started to seem like there was more ways that the computer would not recognize me than the computer would recognize me. I had to sit down, like very carefully sit down slowly and looking straight at the camera. It was about the only way it would recognize me. But Shortlist, access control, the idea is ways to identify users. Something unique. You know, so that's what all these have in common. It's only 10,000, if we do 4-digit PIN numbers, like banks on the ATM card, it's only 10,000 possible values, but there's way more than 10,000 people accessing that, right? Or that have ATM cards at different banks. Most banks anymore have more than 10,000 customers, unless they're just like a small. Oh. He was driving earlier, I guess he had come. So there's duplicated numbers. Same thing with RFID. There's only so many numbers to go around. I was using the example about when that goes bad on a key fob, and then your ignition that's looking for that particular signal won't find it and won't let you start your car. But like the lock signals on those radio frequencies, there's only so many frequencies. Way fewer frequencies to check than there are cars. But they're scattered around, so the odds are that your key fob's not going to unlock somebody else's car. But sometimes it will. Has anybody ever done that? Just so happens that your the button for your car unlocks somebody else's car in a parking lot, or garage doors, like somebody else in your neighborhood is also able to open your garage.
Yes,
garage.
I have.
It's a little odd when it happens, but it the odds are against it, but not impossible. And that's, I wanted to wrap up the cybersecurity thing there, because the best we can do is mitigation. We can keep going with keep doing things to increase those odds so that it's less and less and less likely, but we can't ever get to a 0% chance. We can't ever get to that impossibility. So sometimes it does happen. And like when we write a big secure password, like a whole sentence, that if we went and checked the math on it, say like, okay, some brute force software would need 2 billion years to crack this password, there is still a chance that it could crack it on the first try. 2 billion years is to try every possible combination. And when it gets it is sort of a luck of the draw thing, like a lottery ticket. So those were the rest of those list of terms and things. Y'all have probably heard about a lot of them. Just want to keep them in mind. And the key point they have in common is this definition here. It's a way to uniquely identify users as individuals or as groups or as members of a group, and keep track of what they have access to. We can control that and really mitigate the problem. Make it as hard as you can for somebody to get into your system, and then hopefully they'll go find a system that's easier to get into. Is the main idea with those in cybersecurity, because there's lots of ways into a system. As you all noticed on last week's discussion board, there were some interesting cybersecurity breaches that have happened in the last few months that y'all wrote about, or a couple of them. A couple of y'all wrote about companies where they tried to cover up a cybersecurity breach and hid that information for a while, which that makes it much, much worse, right? If somebody gains access to like bank account numbers, the bank can let everybody know, and then they change their numbers as quickly as possible before people have time to access their accounts. But if they tried to hide it and nobody knows to do anything, there's still no protection for whatever was accessed across those. So I was glad to see that in the discussion board. A lot of people noticed that the people who tried, the big companies that tried to cover up or kind of hide that they'd had a big breach, is much, much worse than just dealing with the breach and stepping forward and letting professionals and regulatory commissions know that there was a data breach and something needs to be done about it, instead of hiding it for 5 or 6 months or trying to get away with it as long as they can. But at the introduction level, lots and lots of terms to memorize. A lot of them y'all have heard before. So just hopefully bringing them up to the front of your mind and in context, so that as you think about those, you know the context they fit in. Password isn't a random piece of data. You have that context that turns it into information. And those heading to study cybersecurity, there's going to be lots and lots of study on that and turn that into knowledge and wisdom over time. That flow that we talked about over and over again this semester. An ancient need for humans, just computers are the modern tool for handling that. What time is it? 1:46. Okay, so probably a good time to take a break. And then afterwards, we'll talk about virtual machines and maybe a short note on graph, some things about graph. I might push that back till next week because there's something about graphics I was going to talk about next week. But does 10 minutes sound good to everybody?
Yes.
And then we'll be back to a doing something activity instead of looking at definitions. Because virtual machines, we can do stuff at the introduction level. So I'll see y'all in a few minutes. I'm going to go get some coffee.